Colin Smith hadn't reached his second birthday when he was infected with HIV. His parents didn't know. They thought the injections he'd been given were helping to make his life better. Colin's life was a short one. At 7, he was dead. What killed him was the contaminated blood products used to treat his haemophilia.
You know, and that's how he was all the time. Smile, always smiling, that kid. Even if he had to bleed, you know, he'd just say, oh, get the factor VIII, you know, because that was his lifeline, wasn't it? And that's what killed him.
His wasn't the only life shattered like this.
We were obviously just used as guinea pigs for research into the AIDS virus.
We've had over 1,000 deaths now in this country, and there will be many more people dying of HIV and hepatitis C.
By the end of '84, I was still asking my consultant, is the product safe to use? Is there anything I should be concerned about? And the answers were always no.
I want closure, perhaps, and a sorry, because I think if they've been underhanded in any way, then children don't deserve that.
From the early 1970s to the mid-1980s, 4,500 haemophiliacs in the UK were infected with lethal viruses in the blood products designed to help them. 2,000 have since died from hepatitis C or HIV. That much is known, but what really happened? There's never been a proper public inquiry in Britain to ask if our scientists ignored warnings, or if they exploited haemophiliacs for scientific kudos, or if our politicians put cutting costs before saving lives. Now Newsnight's had access to fresh evidence from those years, and it makes for uncomfortable reading. People with haemophilia lack blood clotting agents, so can bleed painfully, not just from a cut, but into their joints and internally. Until the 1950s, there was no treatment, but since then, injections of blood products have helped. Early versions, such as an extract called cryoprecipitate, were cumbersome and meant a trip to hospital. But in the 1970s, something new arrived, a concentrated solution they could inject at home, called factor VIII.
Well, the factor VIII was more convenient, just that you didn't have to go up to hospital to get treatment. You could take the treatment home with you, keep it in the fridge.
What haemophiliacs didn't know was that the majority of the plasma used to make factor VIII came from places like this US prison in Arkansas, which paid each donor $2 for their blood and sold it on for up to $70. The prisoners themselves ran the blood service. Many were allowed to donate despite the obvious risk of spreading infection. Carol Grayson lost her husband just 2 years ago this week. He was given blood products from that very prison. She's just finished a research thesis on how thousands of haemophiliacs in the UK became infected.
They bought from the most high-risk donors. That they failed to take notice of warnings when key scientists and doctors, warned them the dangers of importing blood, that they failed to invest in UK services.
One of the victims of that underinvestment was what's now known as the Bioproducts Laboratory in Elstree. This building is central to the story, the government-owned factory for NHS blood products. It's under new management now and it's been upgraded, but in the 70s it was struggling to survive. Cash was short, and one inspector's report said its practices were so bad, if it had been a commercial organisation, it would have been shut down. This is where things started to go wrong. The health minister at the time was David, now Lord Owen. He secured extra funding for Elstree to help avoid blood donations from abroad that he says he knew were dangerous. In 1975, he told Parliament about the extra money, but later found out it hadn't been spent.
I was Foreign Secretary in '78, and I just assumed by then probably we were self-sufficient. I wouldn't have been too surprised if it slipped to '79. But then in the early '80s, I discovered not only were we not self-sufficient, but we were actually more dependent than we'd been.
He remains furious that Parliament wasn't told that Elstree had not had the money it needed to keep up with demand. He says not only was an important democratic principle violated, but lives put at risk.
If we had gone for self-sufficiency, I am pretty confident that we would have had a substantial reduction in the number of contaminated blood supplies. It wouldn't have completely ruled it out, but I think much fewer people would have got hepatitis C, and also fewer people would have got AIDS.
This story has been bedevilled by documents that have gone missing. Lord Owen's, to his horror, weren't kept. Even more mysteriously, many of the official documents from those crucial years during the early 1980s have also disappeared. 2 years ago, the government claimed the documents had been shredded by a junior member of staff, but some copies remained intact. Carol Grayson unearthed them in the vaults of her solicitor's office in Newcastle. The Department of Health asked for them back, but not before Carol had photocopied many of them. She says many of these have never before been made public. Carol and Pete were looking for answers, but for Pete it had come too late. He deteriorated shortly afterwards, and his death, when it came, was not dignified.
He knew that he had very short time left because they'd asked him to sign this do not resuscitate because they said there was no point. And we actually talked about that, and that was really distressing because he said, I told them to wait for you to come because you always make decisions with me. He said, I don't know what you think. He said, I've just signed to tell them, not to resuscitate me. And he said, so I've only got like a short time left.
Pete, in common with other haemophiliacs, had multiple infections. Some joke about having the full portfolio of viruses.
My husband was one person receiving treatment, and during the course of his treatment he was infected with HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, then had 6 exposures to CJD, and then ended up in his final days getting C. difficile in hospital.
The documents Carol unearthed went back to the government, but it's so far refused to release these on grounds of commercial confidentiality. They came too late to be included in the official story of the failure over self-sufficiency. Successive governments have said that scientists, civil servants and politicians simply didn't know enough about the dangers of factor VIII concentrates to stop using them. But the documents we've seen suggest that everyone knew a lot more a lot earlier than they've ever admitted, with fears over hepatitis C as early as 1976 and over AIDS as early as 1982. One of the most shocking is this letter from the head of public surveillance at the time, warning about the risk of AIDS in factor VIII after Britain's first case in Cardiff, and calling for all US imports to be banned. Now, this was in May 1983, before most UK haemophiliacs were infected with HIV. In spite of this warning, factor VIII imports were not banned, and thousands of haemophiliacs are still living with the consequences. Hayden Lewis is one of them. He's already lost a haemophiliac uncle to HIV, and his brother has both HIV and hepatitis C. In 1985, with 2 young children, he was told that he too had contracted HIV. When Hayden decided to check his medical records, he was shocked to find he'd been infected a year earlier.
From June 84 until February 85, there was no mention that I was positive by my consultant. And through that period, I could have infected my wife or my children, for that matter.
After that, Hayden took extreme precautions to protect his wife Gaynor and says there's no way he could have infected her. But a test confirmed their worst fears. She too was HIV positive.
I just wouldn't accept what I think I suspected, and I just kept going, I'm not even going to discuss it or think about it until I get told, and then I'll deal with it. It was pretty bad, and Gaynor was brilliant, because if anyone should have been upset, it should have been Gaynor. But I was the one that was emotionally out of control.
The likelihood is she was infected during the time when his doctors failed to tell Hayden about his HIV status. Not only did they not tell him his result, but they didn't tell him they were testing at all. Hayden is suspicious now about their motives in keeping quiet. He's a mild haemophiliac, so there's a strong case that he could have remained on cryoprecipitate, which carried less danger of infection. Hayden is part of a haemophilia network called Tainted Blood. They've passed Newsnight documents collected over 2 decades. These show that things were in a state of flux during the 1980s because 2 products were available: ordinary factor VIII concentrate and heat-treated versions designed to kill off viruses. The documents Hayden's uncovered show doubts were raised at the time. In one meeting on October the 17th, 1983, of the UK's regional haemophilia directors, one said she had unlimited supplies of cryoprecipitate, so there was clearly no shortage. But Hayden's also found out there were trials by scientists at the time on factor VIII for what's now called hepatitis C. Minutes of meetings talk of the need for previously untreated patients, or virgin haemophiliacs.
You can catch?
These phrases have come to haunt Hayden. He believes he was part of a research study for a product he didn't need and for which he certainly didn't give consent.
It was evident to me that I met the criteria of being a previously untreated patient with commercial products. There's no excuse for not informing a patient of a risk. There's no excuse for not asking for their consent. It's deplorable and criminal, I would even suggest.
Professor Geoffrey Savage was a key figure among haemophilia experts during the 1980s and has decided to speak out for the first time. We asked him if there's any reason why doctors carrying out studies would not have needed to gain consent first.
It does seem to be very unusual, because one would have thought that clinical trials done on a professional basis would have to follow the rules and regulations and have to keep the patients fully informed and actually ensure that you have their written consent.
2 of Tainted Blood's documents reveal startling discussions about the use of chimpanzees and people in scientific studies. This one talks about early attempts to reduce the infectivity in blood products with hepatitis C. It talks about how these batches were tested by injecting them into chimpanzees, though there were very few of these animals available. Just a few months later, in January 1982, this letter talks about how 4 commercial companies are poised to introduce heat-treated factor VIII. It talks about a shortage of chimpanzees and says it's unlikely these companies will be able to guarantee quality control for future batches. It says it's therefore very important to find out by studies in human beings the extent to which infectivity had been reduced. Hayden isn't the only one who believes he was secretly tested. In Scotland, Robert Mackey was infected with HIV in 1984. He says he was being used like a laboratory rat. At the time, he was only a mild haemophiliac and didn't need to be on factor VIII.
Nobody ever told me that it was thousands and thousands and thousands of donors went into one pool to make one batch of factor VIII.
And do you think that the doctors who were giving you that factor VIII knew that there were risks?
Yes, beyond any doubt, they knew of the risks.
He discovered by accident that his doctor, Professor Ludlam of the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, was doing a lot more than looking after patients. In a medical newsletter in 1990, he described a unique group of patients in Scotland that had formed the basis of several years of important research he'd published on AIDS. When Rob saw this, he decided to check his records. He later discovered he'd been infected in 1984, but wasn't told until 1987. And even more strangely, the words AIDS study are clearly written in his medical notes before he was infected. Rob's convinced he was part of scientific attempts to understand the virus behind AIDS, but they didn't tell him. Rob now relies on his wife, Alice, to care for him. He's often sick, but over the last 10 years, he's tried to find out the truth. He He's discovered that in April 1983, before he was infected, AIDS specialists at one of America's top medical institutions wrote in The Lancet about how valuable it would be to locate a group of haemophiliacs in a country not yet affected by AIDS. Professor Ludlam offered up his patients in response. Mark is another patient of Professor Ludlam's. He's dying of AIDS, but doesn't want to show his face because, astonishingly, he wasn't told for 6 years that he was HIV positive. During that time, he had many girlfriends. And looking back on it, what do you think were their motives in not telling you?
They were certainly collecting information. I have copies of that stuff from 1985 onwards, where he is broadcasting to the rest of the world what has been going on, but he doesn't have the manners, courtesy or sense to tell his patient, who lives 30 miles away, what has happened.
Both men have shown us their medical records. Just like Rob, Mark's records clearly state AIDS study. Professor Ludlam failed to tell either of them that they were infected with HIV or that they were part of his studies.
My faith and trust has dwindled even further. As snippets of information are collected, it becomes more and more apparent that these people, they seem to know what they were doing. They were simply scrutinising me from a distance and watching what the reaction was.
1983, by June 1983, when the European Commissioners put out R83-8, a warning that all haemophiliacs in Europe, including the United Kingdom, was to be informed of the risks of AIDS. Why weren't we warned of the risks?
And if you had been told, did you have any options?
If I had been told I would have ceased treatment of factor VIII, any blood products of that time, if I had been informed of the seriousness and the devastating effect that AIDS has got on the human anatomy, I would never, ever have taken that product.
We asked Professor Ludlam why he hadn't told Rob or Mark that they were part of his research studies and that he was testing them. We asked why he delayed telling them their results, so putting other lives at risk. And we asked about the American call for help with research and his response. He said he had a duty of confidentiality to individual patients, even though Rob and Mark themselves want answers. And he declined to take part in our film because of a potential investigation by the General Medical Council. The other big question that Britain's haemophiliacs want answered is why their doctors didn't make the switch to heat-treated factor VIII concentrates sooner. Professor Savage did make that switch and got wrapped over the knuckles because the heat-treated material was much more expensive.
There was scientific evidence at that time, towards the end of '83, as I said, to show that HIV was a virus. It was heat susceptible. So it doesn't really need to be the brain of Britain to work out that perhaps a heat-treated product would be infinitely better than an unheated one.
Did have any of your colleagues ever expressed any regret at not taking the same route that you did at the time?
No.
Does that shock you?
No.
Why not?
It's very difficult for a doctor to admit perhaps that he was wrong.
I've been told about a meeting in Barcelona in September 1983 with representatives of all the commercial companies and haemophilia experts from across Europe. Two of those present have told me about furious exchanges over what to do with leftover non-heat-treated factor VIII. There was talk of certain countries agreeing to take on those leftover stocks, and even talk of money available from grateful commercial companies to support research. Some of those present were shocked and objected. Others were more sympathetic. There have been inquiries in other countries and some out-of-court settlements here, though nothing like the amounts awarded elsewhere. In Wales, Colin's parents were given a one-off payment of £20,000, but for them, the money is less important than the truth.
They stick their money, it's got nothing to do with money at all.
We want answers.
I just want answers.
Colin was given his first batch of commercial Factor VIII on the day before his first birthday in August 1983. Then, in 1984, his parents were told he needed a grommet and adenoid operation. His medical notes show he received commercial Factor VIII for that too. Many aspects of Colin's case appear to run against the guidelines at that time.
The recommendations in 83 also indicated that where possible, for children, and these are both the US and the UK recommendations, under the age of 4 should be treated, if possible, with cryoprecipitate.
Colin's parents became suspicious there was more to his ill health than they'd been told because of the reaction of his doctors to one incident. He was sleeping in his brother Daniel's bed.
It was when he had a severe nosebleed. We'd phoned the Heath, and because we just couldn't stop it, and they just said, and it happened overnight. So of course when they got up, they were sort of, Daniel was caked in blood or whatever, and they just said, for God's sake, clean Daniel off. Don't worry about Colin, just clean Daniel off. Did it go in his mouth, or, you know, and that was the first time really that the alarm bells rang.
The flags went up and
they said burn the mattress.
Colin's doctors evidently had concerns about his HIV status. In fact, there's a biohazard sticker in his notes dated June 1985. And a month later, Janet asks again about AIDS. The notes say she was reassured. She was never told that Colin had HIV and only told he had AIDS just 2 months before he died in 1990. Colin's parents want to know if he was one of the virgin haemophiliacs scientists are referred to. We asked Colin's doctor at the time, Dr. Colin Hewlett, why he'd operated, why he'd given Colin the Factor VIII concentrate, and why he didn't warn Colin's parents about the risks. Dr. Hewlett retired just last month, but in his final week he sent me this response.
I have no explanation or excuse for the administration of the potentially contaminated Factor VIII concentrate, save not being fully aware of the infective risk at the time. I can't begin to imagine the long-lasting distress and anguish this has caused Colin's mother. All I can do at this stage is to express my regrets and offer my sincere apologies to her for this whole affair.
You're well, you've been well since...
Dr. Rietzer was one of the group of several doctors who, after the 1983 warning, decided it was okay to continue using Factor VIII from the US. Some of these key decision makers are now dead, and Dr. Rietzer himself is very elderly. I contacted Dr. Rietzer, and he invited me to his home, though he wouldn't be filmed. He did concede there'd been a culture of gathering as much data as possible, especially on new products. He said scientific research projects referred to as trials were actually just monitoring studies because all the patients needed the Factor VIII anyway. He said, we shouldn't have used the word trials. We didn't think people would be looking back now at the particular words. He said patients did give consent, though he couldn't remember if that was written or verbal. He said when you're faced with a chap at 2 a.m. that's bleeding, you're faced with what's on the shelf. All eyes are now on the private inquiry that starts taking evidence tomorrow. Some former health ministers have already said they'll testify, and there are even signs that the current government may cooperate. Perhaps those commercially confidential documents are about to be handed over.
There is now a danger that has become a threat to us all. It is a deadly disease and there is no known cure.
Remember those 1980s adverts about AIDS? The fear for surviving haemophiliacs is that the full story comes too late, that the scientists and politicians keep quiet, leaving hundreds without answers, left to die in ignorance.